So on page 1259, Roxburgh et al. Write this. Philosophical questions such as what are the essential features of suffering are answered by means of intellectual process such as reflecting, thinking, analyzing, and dialogue. This, I think, kind of matches up really well with my idea that suffering is a mental or a meaning-generated perspective. One of my students said recently that that he thinks about suffering as a psychosocial kind of activity. It's not just pain, it's not just disease, but it is there's this kind of meaning that's attached to the pain, and that's the thing that brings suffering, or an awareness that somebody else doesn't have that same kind of experience, or that you yourself didn't have that same kind of experience 48 hours ago, and you just want it different, you want it better, you want it to go back like it was before, or something like that. That suffering is meaning making, and I think that what Frankl says here, I mean it's Roxburgh saying it, but Roxburgh echoing Frankl, I think is helpful. So I want to draw attention to, on the next page, 1260, to a statement that Frankl makes, Roxburgh makes at the top, number 6. And he says that the sufferer always asks, why me? I'm not so sure. There are many, in fact, again, a conversation with students that I've had where they have reflected that their own religious tradition says you don't ask why. You don't ask, and the only one you can ask that question of is God, right? So that kind of why am I suffering? Why me? Why did this happen to me? It's not a reflective kind of question aimed simply at myself. It's a question aimed at God. Now, first of all, I don't think there's anything wrong with the question. And as I responded, the Hebrew Bible prophets, they do ask God why. Why did we do nothing wrong and this still happens? Why have we cried out to you for help and there's been no answer? I don't think there's anything wrong with that question. But there are some who, because of discipline, will say, I'm not going to ask why. And so a little bit of critical reading here. Is it the case, is Roxburgh correct, that everyone asks why? Anytime you say always, never, everyone, no one, that alerts me that maybe we're making some assumptions, and assumptions are not the stuff of good research. They're certainly not the stuff of good data gathering, unless you follow that assumption up with data. So that's a little point there that I thought was worth mentioning. On 1261, I really want you to pay attention to his 2A and 2B on that page. You could also look at page 1262, second full paragraph from the bottom, for the continuation of this conversation about whether human life has intrinsic value or whether value is established by doing something else, or value for the sake of another thing. But I think that 2A and 2B on page 1261 really gets, in many ways, for me, the heart of the issue for the Roxburgh article. As we think about whether one can suffer and not have meaning in their life, or if the very fact that you are saying that you are suffering and you want it to be different, that in itself is meaning or meaning making, that the two go hand in hand. Very important kind of philosophical argument that's going on page 1261, 1262 that I want to draw your attention to, because I think it will help you think about this issue of suffering. And of course, for me, it seems really helpful because Roxburgh and co-authors kind of see it the same way I do. And so it's hard for me not to be kind of kindly disposed to that argument because we're in agreement here. But you can't just gather people around you that agree with you. You have to dialogue. And I have had people disagree with me already since the last lecture when talked about whether pain and suffering were the same, or whether disease and suffering were the same. It's not universally held. My position, I think, is the majority position, but it is not the only position. So you can continue to ask yourself, is pain equal to suffering, or is suffering something else? Which would, again, remember where I started last week with Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, having to do with life having a fair amount of suffering in it, kind of a universal experience of suffering. So on page 1262, this is where the Roxburgh article breaks down for me a little bit, but maybe it's unfair of me because I'm a biblical scholar, and so, especially as it relates to the Old Testament, I don't know that I see Job the same way that Roxburgh did. And an essential question having to do with something he says on page 1262 is whether Job did find meaning in his suffering by contemplating and reflecting on the greatness of God. I think Job contended almost to the bitter end, I didn't do anything wrong. And so Job's hopefulness, since we can also talk about hope, Job's hopefulness was really challenged because he couldn't find a reason for the suffering. And that's why I say that Job is in dialogue with another tradition, and it's that tradition in Deuteronomy that you see, especially in chapters 27 and 28. If you do well, things are going to work out okay. If you don't do well, then your life is going to be hard. And Job says, I did well, and now things are hard. Things are difficult. And is Job reflecting and contemplating? He is. And these comforters that come along, and I'm not so sure Roxburgh gets the comforters right, but these comforters that come alongside him after sitting with him for 7 days, and Roxburgh really treats that well, the importance of sitting with people and just being there and being present in the moment. But where the problem is for Job and for Job's comforters is that after that 7 days of silence and silent reflection with him, then they begin to tell him everything that he's done wrong. And they reason from the current situation to the past. You must have failed God in some way, or this wouldn't be happening to you. That's their comfort. And Job steadfastly resists that. So I'm not so sure that Job discovers as much as Roxburgh seems to give him credit for in his reflection. His reflection seems to be kind of entrenched in the idea that God, for whatever reason, has put his finger on me, or allowed Hashatan, the Satan, the adversary, to put his finger on me, and I don't have an explanation for it. And then at the end, if there's anything that's revealed in Job, it's not so much bad acting as it is an attitude of pride. Maybe you can say that in the last 8 chapters of Job, but you're hard pressed to make any case stronger than that. So then finally, page 1264, Roxburgh et al. Write this: a holistic concept of the human being in healthcare has to take suffering into consideration, because when a person in pain seeks healthcare, it is not only his or her body that suffers, but the whole person as a unity of body, psyche, and spirit. And I think we should end there. I think that's a really good place for us to kind of let the conversation sit as we contemplate suffering and how it impacts those around us. So we'll be back next week. That concludes what we're doing on hope and suffering.